Welcome back, everyone. This is week 33 of Our Mothers Knew It, and we have a lot of ground to cover this week. This week, you're going to cover 10 chapters. You're going to go from 43 all the way through 52. And in those chapters, you go deep into the war chapters of Alma. And I know you might have some trepidation about heading into the war chapters, but I actually love these chapters. I think there's very few sections in the Book of Mormon that have as much application to our day as this one does. Because I really feel like a big part of our goal in this mortal life is to figure out how to live and think and be celestial in a very telestial world. And I think that's what the war chapters are. I think that's what I love about them, at least, is you see this gristly, hard environment, and then these mighty men of valor who just shine out. They have opportunities to be telestial and to acclimate to those waters, and instead they stand. You know, when Moroni raises that title of liberty, it is this beaming moment of thinking celestial in a very telestial world. So studying his strategies, his tactics, the way he interacts with people around him, it gave me all kinds of tools in my tool belt to use in my day. I really think you're going to love the application of it. You just have to go in with fresh eyes. There's so much to learn from the tactics Moroni uses, the tactics Helaman and Alma use, even things like Tiancum. I think there's good things to learn. This week is loaded with big, strong examples of what it's like to live celestial in a very war-ridden telestial world. And there's so much we can learn from it. I think this is a power-packed section of study, and you're going to love it. So grab your scriptures, grab your notes. It's time to get started. Thankfully, I don't have to teach you everything in the 10 chapters because we don't do that around here. You guys, I'm just going to give you 9. So I'm going to focus in these 2 videos on 9 things that I loved about this week's study. I'm going to package them in 3 different teaching techniques. The first one I call sparks. These are just insights or ideas, new things that came to the surface for me as I studied with fresh eyes this week in these 10 chapters. Then we're going to have questions. These are questions to get you thinking, to get you into your scriptures, and to hopefully have really good conversations with like the people around you, or maybe even give you the guts to raise your hand on Sunday and make a comment or ask a question in class to have good conversations start in a bigger group. And then I'll do a second video of the 3 object lessons, because I really think it's powerful to take the things you love about this week's study and find some way to pass that love on to the next generation. And the way to do that for me is with object lessons, things that catch my kids' eye, get them curious, and hopefully get them into their scriptures. So we'll cover that one in the second video. But since I can't cover all the things, I do think I need to take some time to give you a summary of what's coming at you, because there's a lot of history that's packed into these few years and these 10 chapters. So settle in. This is going to take a second, but let me tell you where you're heading this week. So in 43, this is where you see the Lamanites rise up in aggression against the Nephites. This is also where you see Moroni kind of come to the surface. We don't know anything about his backstory. You guys, I don't know who his dad is. I don't know how he became this mighty man of valor. All I know is that at 25, with probably a young wife and maybe young little toddler kids, he is this incredible general for the Nephite army, and he will be steady throughout all of these chapters. So you're going to see him rise up against the Lamanite aggression in chapter 43. They're going to win the battle, and then Moroni stops in the middle to offer this opportunity for a covenant of peace right in the middle of the battle. In fact, what amazes me this week throughout all these chapters is that Moroni has that sort of control. He has control over his passions, so that even in the heat of battle, when the enemy is attacking, and the Nephites didn't want this war. They don't want aggression. They don't want conquering. They just want to defend their families, their homes, their freedom. And in that key moment when he could defeat his enemy, he offers a hand of mercy. And that's what you find in 44. Zerahemnah is the leader of the Lamanites, and he has this opportunity from Moroni to set down his weapons and make a covenant of peace. And he won't do it. He'll set down his weapons, but he won't make that covenant. And so Moroni has to hand him his weapons back and say, okay, so we're doing this. You know, like it's an incredible moment in the history of the Nephites. That's 44. 45 is when you see things shift, because the Nephites gain the victory in that key moment with Moroni as their leader. Zerahemnah is ultimately defeated, as are all of his armies, and so they retreat. And then the Nephites praise God, right? Because they've, again, been delivered. This is also where you get just a taste of Alma this week. It's our last taste of Alma's words. And he's going to teach some prophecies to his son, Helaman. We're going to talk about this in the Sparks, because I loved it that much. But that's what you're going to see in 45. You also start to see some internal dissensions kick up at the very end of 45, which is what leads you into 46. Because in the first few chapters, you see Lamanites being aggressive towards the Nephites. around 46, you start to see Satan change his tactics. Because for a while, he's been trying to attack the Nephites from the outside, and that hasn't been successful. And so now he's going to attack from within, and he does it through a man named Amalickiah. Amalickiah is a Nephite. He's a dissenter of the Nephites. He's someone who wants to overthrow liberty. He wants to get rid of the system of judges that they have and go back to a monarchy. And he wants to do it with himself as king. So he has this almost secret combination-y feel to his words, and he lures people towards his way. This is why the title of liberty happens, because Moroni sees his own people falling apart from this freedom that they have fought for, and he won't have it. You 25-year-old Moroni will not have it. And so he stands up and he raises the title of liberty and he rallies the Nephites against these dissenters. And because the dissenters cower in that moment, they retreat towards the Lamanites. And that sort of sets the stage for what comes in 47. So 47 is when you see Amalickiah change tactics. Instead of just trying to get the Nephites to dissent, now he's going to get the Lamanites to attack. His whole goal is to conquer everybody. He doesn't want to just be king of the Lamanites. He wants the Nephites in subjection to him. And so he's going to come up with all these kind of machinations to find a way to get to the top of the Lamanite pyramid and then attack the Nephites. And that's what kind of happens in those chapters. He'll use poison and he'll assassinate people, and he is an interesting type and shadow for the adversary, and we'll talk about him. That takes you into 48, because this is where you see Moroni pushing back against Amalickiah's efforts. Amalickiah thinks he's winning. He thinks he's pushing and going to win this war, and Moroni knows differently. He knows the promises of God, especially about this land, and so he builds the people up from within. He builds fortifications, he strengthens the cities. This is when you learn more about how he fortifies cities in these ingenious ways. You'll see a lot of that in 48. 49 is where Moroni's tactics really shine, because essentially the Lamanites attack the cities they think are weak, like Ammoron and Noah, and they can't. They are defeated. Even though they vastly outnumber the Nephites, they are stunned by Moroni's tactics. I think they're even shocked by the strength of the Nephite people, thanks to men who are no less serviceable, like Helaman and Corianton and Shiblon. These people who've been teaching from within, and Moroni's fortifications from without give them this power punch to defeat even an outnumbering army like the Lamanites. Then in 50, you learn a little bit more about what they're going to do to fortify the cities. The problem that you run into is they're in the process of fortifying all the cities, not just these border towns. And in the middle of that process of fortification, dissensions arise. This is when you start to see the beginnings of the kingmen. These are men who want to be king. They think there should be a higher class of people among the Nephites. And so they are pushing back against men like Moroni and against men like Helaman. And so it becomes this giant distraction. Moroni and Helaman have to focus their efforts on taking care of their own dissensions within their ranks, and then they can't keep their troops on the border towns, which allows Amalickiah, who is now the leader of the Lamanites, to swoop in and take advantage of their weakened position. And he wins for a while. You guys, Amalickiah wins for a while. He gets city after city after city, and now he has these cities that are fortified. Thanks to the ingenious efforts of Moroni, it's really hard to conquer that city back, because there's pickets and towers and frames, and all the fortifications that Moroni built are now being taken advantage of by the Lamanites. And that kind of takes you into 51, where it becomes this battle between the kingmen and the freemen. Thankfully, the freemen dominate. There is this moment when Moroni basically says to the kingmen, set down the contentions that are getting into our hearts and help us fight the Lamanites. And the kingmen won't. They won't pick up arms. They won't fight for their people. And so Moroni has to take things into his own hands. And it takes 2 years and a lot of other great guys like Teancum to tip the scales in the favor of the Nephites. But by the end, when you get to 52, you can see the Nephites starting to gain ground. They're starting to get their cities back. They're starting to rebound. But we're not going to get the full story this week. It's almost as if Mormon is setting the stage for what you're going to find next week when you learn all about the Stripling warriors. So that's the 10 chapters. Now let's head into some of the sparks that I just couldn't resist. Spark number 1, I call the invisible armor of light. And if you've been in this course with me for a while, you know how much I love armor. I think we've made shields and swords. We've made games around armor. We've made bows and arrows. I have a thing for armor. I love the metaphor of armor when you see it in scripture. It's It's this promise of a covering, a protection for you and for your family in this very celestial world. So when I see armor in scriptures, especially this week in all these war chapters, I pay attention. So here's one of the ones that sparked for me as I was reading. This is Alma 43, 19 and 20. So in 19, you're going to see them talk about what the Nephites come to the battle with. This is that initial battle with the Lamanites led by Zerahemnah, and they come with all kinds of armor that the Lamanites have never seen before, and they're sort of like caught off guard by their strength. This is how it plays out in verse 20. Now the army of Zerahemnah, that's the Lamanite army, was not prepared with any such thing. They only had their swords and their scimitars, their bows and their arrows, their stones and their slings. And they were naked, save it were a skin which was girded about their loins. Yea, all were naked, save it were the Zoramites and the Amalekites. Everybody on the Lamanite forces is vulnerable. They are exposed to the weapons of the Nephites. And they think because they have such great numbers, and maybe even because they have the Zoramites and the Amalekites, people who know the Nephite tactics, they assume they're going to have the upper hand. But this armor is hard to conquer. That's what I love as you see play out in the verses. So this armor protects them in that first wave of battle. This is 37 and 38. And the work of death commenced on both sides. But it was more dreadful on the part of the Lamanites, for their nakedness was exposed to the heavy blows of the Nephites, of their swords and their scimitars, which brought death at almost every stroke. While on the other hand, there was now and then a men fall among the Nephites by their swords and loss of blood, they being shielded from the more vital parts of the body, or the more vital parts of the body being shielded from the strokes of the Lamanites by their breastplates and their arm shields and their head plates. It's the vital parts of the body that caught my eye. What armor promises is not that you will be perfectly bubbled. You're not wrapped in bubble wrap. You have the most vital parts of you that are shielded. So that in these battles, even though there are wounds and there are hard hits that come, you will stand. Like you will have the strength you need to live another day if you protect the most vital parts of your body. What's interesting is in this battle, that outer armor only goes so far. There are nooks and crannies in this armor where weapons can get in. I think you see this play out in the verses. So this is 44 of the same chapter. And they were inspired by the Zoramites and the Amalekites, who were their chief captains and leaders, and by Zerahemnah, who was their chief captain or their chief leader and commander. Yea, they did fight like dragons. This is describing the Lamanites fighting against the Nephites in this defensive armor. They fought like dragons, and many of the Nephites were slain by their hands. Yea, they did smite them in two, many of their head plates. They did pierce many of the breastplates, and they did smite off many of their arms. And thus the Lamanites did smite in fierce anger. This armor, as good as it is, and as strong as it is not invincible. It can be penetrated with these spears. It can be cracked into with their swords. It is not enough on its own. What I love about this chapter is Moroni, when he sees his people afraid, because there gets to a tipping point in this battle where the Nephites see all the damage and they see the size of the forces of the Lamanites and they start to fear. And Moroni reminds them of what they have below this armor, that they have an invisible armor. This is the part that I love. To me, it's all about covenants. He tries to help them understand that their armor, it will only take them so far. And what they need is the help of the Lord, this deeper well of covenant connection that gives them a promise of deliverance. And so he inspires them in this heat of the battle to tap into this invisible armor. This is how it's phrased. This is 49 and 50. This is the results of Moroni's pep talk. And it came to pass that they turned upon the Lamanites, and they cried with one voice unto the Lord their God for their liberty and their freedom from bondage. And they began to stand against the Lamanites with power. And in that selfsame hour, they cried unto the Lord for their freedom. The Lamanites began to flee before them, and they fled, even to the waters of Sidon. Nothing about their armor has changed. Nothing about their muscle strength has changed. Nothing physically about the Nephites has changed. What they did is they remembered their invisible armor, this promise of protection. The reason that matters so much to me is I feel like oftentimes in the church, like in our daily discipleship and the programs of the church and the things that the church has set up for us, they're kind of like armor to me. I just sent both my boys to EFY. To me, that's kind of like putting armor on them. Like, it's just one more effort in my part to help them have a solid understanding of the gospel and to know that they are not alone. And a lot of the programs of the church do that for us. Even going to the temple, I feel like, is like putting on this armor, right? It helps me for yet another week to stay strong. But it is not enough on its own. The programs of the church, as good as they are not enough on their own. We need covenant connections. We need to remember we have invisible armor. In the New Testament, Paul calls this the armor of light. It's one of my favorite verses. He talks about the power of it. He says, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. Yea, put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ. For me, especially coming out of conference where we heard so much about wearing the garments of the holy priesthood and choosing to respect and honor their power, the capacity that they have to give us, I shouldn't say their power, the capacity they have to give us the Lord's power and that protection, we can't cast that off. It is this invisible armor of light, not the clothing itself, but what it represents, that we have the same connection that these Nephites on the battlefield had. They have a connection to a deeper source of power. And even if nothing about the outside of you changes, the promise is that you'll have the strength you need. You can be delivered just as they were if you make and keep those covenants. I just think the spark that hit me the most was that we need both. In this world, I need both. I need the structure of the church. I need the programs that it puts in place. I need the invitations to daily discipleship and holy habits that help me armor up. And I also need deeper covenant connections so that in these moments when even that armor seems to crack, I have access to something deeper. I have access to a power that is infinite in its nature and can help me thrive, even when nothing else around my circumstances has changed. I can witness that that's true. I've seen it. And I loved seeing it in this battle strategy in 43. Spark number 2, I call planted promises. And it actually stems from something I read in Joseph Smith history just this last week. I was prepping for YSA, and this verse kind of came to the surface. It's one that was quoted by President Eyring in just this last conference. But this is when the angel Moroni, so not Captain Moroni, but Mormon's son Moroni, when he comes to Joseph Smith much later and is prepping him for the time when he will receive the plates, he quotes a verse of Malachi, but he doesn't quote it directly. He uses a different set of words. So he says, and he shall plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. If it were not so, the whole earth would be utterly wasted at his coming. What I love that Moroni adds is the planting, because it's almost like he's telling us how the hearts of the fathers turn to the children and the children to the fathers. It's the planting of promises that turns hearts. And that's what I see in Alma. This is our last piece of Alma's story, so I couldn't go past it without spending a spark here. Like, Alma has been this incredible figure for us to study, both from his early days as a kid of a prophet who rebelled and his mid-years where he was leading the saints away from God to the time when he changes course and sets a whole new trajectory for his life. He is this incredible prophet of God. And we've had all these chapters to study him, so I didn't want to skip over the end of his story. This is what he says at the end. He is planting promises in this week's study. And what I love is when you get into Alma 45, you see what grows because of all the time that Alma spent in the soil. He's been planting promises in the hearts of the converts around him and in the hearts of his sons. And when he has this interview moment with Helaman, you see those seeds sprout in remarkable ways. So this is Alma 45, 2 through 8-ish. I'm going to just read you 2 through 5 right now. It says, and it came to pass that in the 19th year of the reign of the judges over the people of Nephi, that Alma came unto his son Helaman and said unto him, believest thou the words which I spake unto thee concerning those records which I have kept? And Helaman said, yea, I believe. And Alma said, believest thou in Jesus Christ, who shall come? And he said, yea, I believe all the words which thou hast spoken. I think as a parent, this is what I pray for, right? I hope that by the end of my life, I could ask any one of my kids. I don't have to have a big interview with them. I don't have to ask them a whole bunch of series of questions. I simply have to ask, do you believe the words that I taught you? And if your kids can answer back and say, yes, I believe all the words that you taught me, then I feel like I've done what God needed me to do. Not just my own kids. I think anyone in your sphere of influence, whether you're married or not, or have a family or not, like, I just think this is what you're here for. It's what God gave you time for, so that people around you could say, yay, I believe in Jesus Christ, and I believe all the words that you've told me. What I love is that means, essentially, Helaman is testifying that Alma did what Nephi told us to do back in Nephi 25:26, when he said, and we talk of Christ, we rejoice in Christ, we preach of Christ, we prophesy of Christ, and we write according to our prophecies, that our children may know to what source they may look for remission of their sins. It's one thing for Helaman to testify that he believes these things. It's another thing for him to act on those beliefs. So that's where Alma's questions go next. This is Alma 6. And Alma said unto him, the chapter, we're still in 45, this is verse 6. And Alma said unto him again, will ye keep my commandments? And he said, yea, I will keep thy commandments with all my heart. And then Alma said, blessed art thou, and the Lord shall prosper thee in the land. Don't you love that response from Helaman? It's so tender. He doesn't just say, I'll believe. He says, I'll believe with all my heart. These directions that his dad has given him, these promises that he has planted in the soil of Helaman's heart. He promises that he will cultivate those plants, that he will let them grow, that he'll give them the nourishment that they need, so that no matter where Alma goes from here, he can trust that Helaman's heart there will be great fruit that grows here. I just loved it. There's this beautiful talk from Elder Essay it's in the full one's in the notes, but let me give you just a snippet. He said, I'm not certain what went through Helaman's mind as he prepared to give his final response. He knew the necessity of honoring his parents and respecting priesthood authority. His previous actions had verified this fact. I like to think that Helaman's reply was prompted by a heartfelt desire to be obedient rather than by a fear of authority. Deep love of God and Father were reflected in his words. Yea, I will keep the commandments with all my heart. It's a marvelous thing when a father is able to make his commandments square perfectly with God's expectations. Apparently, this condition was achieved by Alma, for Helaman was ready and was willing to obey with all his heart. What I think is cool about this is, I don't think these were surprising answers to Alma. He knows Helaman. He knows his heart. We heard his promises to Helaman a few chapters ago when he was giving his sons their individual guidance. He knows this about Helaman. So why does he ask? Why, in these last moments, does Alma ask Helaman to say it out loud, to make this promise and to certify what he knows? And then I started to think about my experiences in the temple and even in covenants outside of the temple, where I'm invited to say what I believe and to make promises out loud so that he knows where my heart is. And I don't think it's necessarily that Alma needed to hear it one more time. I think Helaman needed to hear it one more time. I think Alma knows that he's about to leave and Helaman's going to need to face an incredibly hard war without him. And he's going to need to lead the stripling warriors. He's going to need to do amazing things. And he needs to remember his covenant connection to God. So by speaking these testimonies out loud, I feel like it's a way for Alma to say, oh son, I want these tethered to your heart. These promises that I've planted in you, I want you to care for them. I want you to cultivate them. This is what's going to give you the strength and the nourishment you need to do all that is ahead of you. I think it's powerful that there's no compulsion in Alma's words. There's no shame. He's not making things more complicated than they need to be. There's these simple questions of, son, do you believe? And what do you believe in? And will you act on those beliefs? I think one of my favorite parts of this week's study is seeing how Alma's story ends, right? Because he sort of like walks off into the sunset. It's this really sweet testimony about who he is, because you hear what happens with the people around him when he just disappears. So this is Alma 45:15. Alma blesses, let me summarize. He blesses his sons, he blesses the church, he blesses all the members of the church, he even blesses the earth. And then this interesting thing happens in 18. And when Alma had done this, blessed all these people, he departed out of the land of Zerahemnah, as if to go to the land of Melech. And it came to pass that he was never heard of more. As to his death or burial, we know not of. And this is the part I loved. Behold, this we know, that he was a righteous man. And the saying went abroad in the church that he was taken up by the Spirit, or buried by the hand of the Lord, even as Moses. But behold, the scriptures saith that the Lord took Moses unto himself, and we suppose that he has also received Alma in the Spirit unto himself. Therefore, for this cause, we know nothing concerning his death and his burial. It's his sons that would have captured these memories. Remember, Helaman is the one that's going to keep the record that Mormon will abridge. So that means in this moment of where his dad took off for the city of Melech and never returned, he doesn't sound afraid. He doesn't sound nervous even. He sounds assured. I think the very fact that Alma walks to Melech, probably knowing that that's the end, right? He just blessed his sons. He blessed the earth. He blessed, I think he knew this was the end. But because of his covenant connection and the promises that he has planted deep in the hearts of his sons, he can walk off with assurance to Melech. And his son can look and see the mystery, right? Helaman has no closure here. He has no idea how this ended. He just knows his dad. And he knows the connection that his dad had with the Lord. And so when he wonders, what happened to dad? The first thing he thinks of is, I think he was taken up. That says so much about who he sees his dad is. And think how far Alma has come. He was much farther than Corianton on the scheme of things when it comes to being on one end of the testimony spectrum. And now he's come so far that everyone that ever knew Alma doesn't assume some terrible thing happened to him. They assume he is lifted up. That tells me a lot about the work that Alma did. His whole life is spent in the soil of planting promises. And when he did it diligently, hearts turned. His son's heart in this moment turns. Because what he captures is this trust that his dad is okay and that he knows exactly how he's going to see him again. Because he knows where he is and how he can get there. I love that part. Spark number 3, I call power by degrees. This week, you're going to see a lot of bad guys, 3 of them in quick succession. First, you're going to see Zerahemnah. He's the leader of the Lamanites that comes against Moroni at the beginning. Then, once he's defeated, a new bad guy pops up. This is Amalickiah. He's the Nephite dissenter who wants to be king, right? And he lasts for a good section of the chapters. Then, when he's eventually killed, you see his brother pick up the torch, and he becomes the bad guy, and that's Ammoron. We just get a sliver of his story today. But what I think is really interesting is the types, right? Moroni, to me, is a clear type of Christ. His attitudes and his actions have this evidence of Christ's character in who he is and how he conducts himself. I also think you learn a lot about the adversary and his tactics by seeing the bad guys. Maybe the reason we love the good guys in the movies and the books that we love so much is because the bad guys are so good. I mean, think about it. If you thought about the hero that you love, the protagonist in any movie or book you've read, it's probably because you also equally hate the bad guy. Like, he's such a good bad guy. And I think you see Mormon setting the stage here. These are actual people. This is not a story. But I think he's writing this to help us see the foil, right? Moroni shines brighter because we see men like Amalickiah and what Satan does to try and lure him in. So it's useful to study the bad guys. One of my favorite interactions of the bad guy is Amalickiah when he's talking to Lehontai. So I go into this deeper. If you go into the 2020 course, if you go on the website, you can watch the original commentary on this. But normally I talk about Lehontai and how he's poisoned by degrees. I love that part of the story where he's like getting convinced to come down the mountain. I saw it differently this time than I'd ever seen it before, but let me set the stage a little bit. Basically, Lehontai is one of the sub-generals of the Lamanite army, and his people don't want to fight the Nephites. They see loss after loss after loss, and they're like, I don't want this anymore. But remember, those Nephite dissenters who are now in charge of the Lamanites, they stir them up. They want the Nephites done. I don't even think they want to eradicate the Nephites. I think what they want to do is cover the light. I think when you have descended away from the light becomes glaring and offensive, and you want to smother it. And that's what Amalickiah is doing. And so he's trying to get control. So he sees Lehontai, he and his men are up on this mount, and he tries to get them to come down because he has permission from the Lamanite king to try and either conquer those men who have kind of defected from the army or persuade them to come down and rejoin them. And so Amalickiah has this plot, right? It's so sneaky. It almost felt like a panther. Have you ever watched a National Geographic video where you see a panther kind of creeping up on its prey? That's what it looks like when you read the story of Amalickiah and Lehontai. Because Lehontai's up on top of the mountain. He won't come down. He says it over and over again. I'm not coming down to meet you. And Amalickiah has this subtle tactic, right? He says, okay, I'm going to come up the mountain towards you, and I just want you to come out. Bring your guards if you want. It's that story. And then, of course, it plays out in the verses. So this is 47, verse 12. And it came to pass that when Amalickiah found that he could not get Lehontai to come down off the mount, he went up to the mount, nearly to Lehontai's camp, and sent again the 4th time his message unto Lehontai, desiring that he would come down and that he would bring his guards with him. He's trying to give him this sense of confidence. It's almost like, do you remember the cheetahs and the topies that Elder Bednar talked about? When those cheetahs kind of creep down into the grass and they make this steady back and forth. You can see that playing out here. Amalickiah wants Lehontai, and so he's got this strategy, and he's just creeping in. This is 17 and 18. Now it was custom among the Lamanites that if their chief leader was killed, to appoint the second leader to be their chief leader. And it came to pass that Amalickiah caused that one of his servants should administer poison by degrees to Lehontai, that he died. This is what you find out in his panther-like approach. He coaxes Lehontai out of his stronghold and then convinces him that he's on his side. He says basically, why don't you bring your guys down the mountain? You can surround my army. If you'll just promise to make me second in command, then I'll make it look like you beat me. Come on down. And so Lehontai does. He comes down. And of course, the policy is there's a second in command. So if Lehontai dies, then the easy option is to add Amalickiah to the top of the pile. And that's what plays out here. And it's in this moment, when I was reading it this time, that I was like, oh, this is not what I thought it was. In the past, I've always seen Amalickiah as the predator and Lehontai as the prey. This time when I read the verses, I think Amalickiah is the prey. Because basically, he is also being poisoned by degrees. It's almost like the little story on Antipas, this mountain where Lahonta is sort of a micro moment of a bigger story that's playing out, that Amalickiah is being poisoned by the adversary by degrees. So I started to look at those chapters with fresh eyes, and I was like, where does it happen? Where does he like come out of his camp and bring his guards with him because he thinks he's strong enough to handle it? Like, where does that happen? And so I started to play with the verses, and a few things caught my eye. So for example, a couple chapters back, 46, 3-5. Now the leader of those who are wroth against the brethren, this is wroth against Helaman, right? Wroth against the prophets. They're mad at those who are testifying and teaching truth. They're angry at those men. They were wroth against their brethren. There was a large and a strong man, and his name was Amalickiah. And Amalickiah was desirous to be a king. And those people who were wroth were also desirous that he should be their king. And they were the greater part of them, the lower judges of the land. And they were seeking for power. And so he sets up the stage, right? You can almost see the adversary coaxing Amalickiah off of his mount. He was a Nephite. He clearly had some position of power. He was a judge, which means he was elected by the people. Like, he is somebody who he is getting coaxed, and Satan is saying, get comfortable. You can bring your guards, bring your friends. It's great. Like, you can see Amalickiah thinks he's in power all the time. And a lot of times in this week's chapters, it'll seem like he is in power. He'll win sometimes. He kills the Lamanite king. He gets to be the top of the Lamanites, and then he also wins some battles against the Nephites. He seems like he's in power. But in reality, Satan is just luring him off his mountain. Like, he is bringing him down and poisoning him by degrees. And the poison that he injects straight into Amalickiah's veins is this poison of greed, power, this desire to stifle the light that is the Nephite people. That's the poison that's getting into his system, and he can't withstand it. In fact, you start to see the effects of this poison in Amalickiah, because he gets a little bit of success, and then he almost goes a little bit crazy. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but it almost sounds that way. So for example, he gets to the point where he wants to drink Moroni's blood. Like, that's how much he hates Moroni and how much he hates the light. He vows with an oath that he will drink the blood of Moroni. It is exactly what we talked about like a month or two ago. Remember I told you that Maxwell quote that I love where he said, selfishness is self-destruction in slow motion? That's Amalickiah, you guys. He is someone who is being coaxed off this mountain and poisoned by degrees. And the more poison, the more pride and power that the adversary gives him, the more numb he is to all of the warnings. Because what was really interesting to me as I studied, and you'll have to study and tell me what you see, is I started to look for the red flags. Like, what are the things that the Lord, I really believe the Lord is in relentless pursuit of Amalickiah as much as he is in relentless pursuit of all the rest of us. That's what Elder Kieran taught. So I started to watch for, what are the red flags? Like, what should Amalickiah have seen? For example, when he goes against the Nephite army and not a single Nephite dies, but thousands of Lamanite dies, that should have been a big red flag. When he goes to the cities of the Nephites and he sees that they've been fortified in a way that nobody's ever seen before, that should have been a red flag, that the Lord is like, Amalickiah, you're on the wrong road. Come back to the right road. He is a Nephite. He's probably made covenants at some point in his childhood, and he is descended from all of that. But this poisoning that Satan has slowly, by degrees, dripped into Amalickiah's system has made him numb. And so he doesn't see things clearly anymore, and he is angry. And he can't channel that anger in any kind of productive way. Instead, it just makes him wither. That's what I feel like you see. So that's when the success happens in small degrees, when Satan is coaxing him off his mountain by letting the kingmen dissent and, causing all kinds of internal struggles among the Nephites. And Amalickiah gets a few victories, and then he starts to get comfortable. And then Teancum comes. You guys, Teancum is one of my favorite people in this week's story. I know a lot of people have questions about the rashness of his decision, but I think he's awesome. Teancum is basically a Nephite commander. Moroni is the general, and Teancum was one of the men who reports to Moroni. And he's got to cover a huge piece of land. The Lamanites are attacking over and over again. The Nephite dissensions with the kingmen are causing confusion. And Teancum basically gets direction from Moroni to just take care of this part of the land. Like, do the best you can. And one of the strategies he has is to sneak in and take out Amalickiah. I just think it's really interesting how it plays out. So this is Alma 51, verse 33. And it came to pass that when the night had come, Teancum and his servant stole forth and went out by night and went into the camp of Amalickiah. And behold, sleep had overpowered them because of their much fatigue, which was caused by the labors and the heat of the day. And it came to pass, Teancum, the good guy, he stole privily into the tent of the king and put a javelin into his heart, and he did cause the death of the king immediately, that he did not wake his servants. Teancum, in this moment, is able to slay Amalickiah. And in my mind, it's because he is totally anesthetized to truth. He's missed all the red flags. He has no protection from the Lord anymore because he's set down every covenant and he's turned against the light. And this is when Satan wins. This is when Satan wins in this moment. That's what he wanted all along. Because he doesn't care about Amalickiah. He didn't care about Zerahemnah, and he won't care about Ammoron. He doesn't care about these bad guys. He uses them as tools to accomplish his purposes. So in my mind, as I was reading these chapters, Amalickiah shifted from being someone who is the predator to being someone who is the prey. And the more I read his story, the more I started watching for those same red flags in my life. Like, what are the signals that the Lord is trying to show me? Maria, you're on the wrong road. Like these big losses or these big mistakes, or what red flags should I be seeing? And how can I get any poison that's kind of crept into my system out? That's one of the powerful things about this week's study is all the witnesses you hear from men like Helaman and Alma and Moroni. They are basically trying to inject you with light so that all the poison is out. It's this antidote. Turn to the light. Keep your covenants, and that will help you squelch the poison that is kind of causing the problem. I think that's his promise. But if you let it run rampant, you end here. This is the end of Amalickiah's story, and it's a sad lesson. There's a beautiful talk from Sister Dalton. If you haven't read it recently, it's when she was talking about defending virtue and bringing virtue back. I can't remember the title of the talk, but it's in the notes. But she basically used this story as a platform to say, are we being poisoned by degrees? Are there things that we are getting acclimated to? I kept just a snippet in this note, but it said, Lehontai was poisoned by degrees until he dies. Not just poisoned, but by degrees. Could it be that this is happening today? Could it be that we first tolerate, then accept, and eventually embrace the vice that surrounds us? This week's chapters invite you to examine that closely and pray for the Spirit to help you see those red flags and know the antidotes that will push that poison out and get you back on your feet. All right, you guys, time to get into the questions next. Here's some things that I'm stewing on, but mostly I'm hoping they give you a chance to have really good conversations and potentially testify in those conversations. Get into your scriptures and see what they teach you. Here's my first question. Alma 44, verse 17, talks about Moroni's anger. This is actually something you're going to see a few times in this week's chapters. Mormon is going to comment on Moroni's anger at certain situations. So, for example, when Zerahemnah, that leader of the Lamanites who they're clearly going to lose the battle, and Zerahemnah refuses to make a covenant of peace. So Moroni gives him back his weapons and says basically like, okay, here we go. Like, he's angry at Zerahemnah's stubbornness. Later, he's going to be angry at the kingmen. Because remember, Moroni has worked his whole adult life to fortify these cities, to give them strength. And the entitled kingmen inside those fortified cities want to get rid of freedom altogether and want to go back to a monarchy. And when they get to a point where the Lamanites are attacking, Moroni says to the kingmen, we're all on the same team here. We're Nephites. I need you to come to the battle. The kingmen basically want him to lose. And so they refuse. They don't pick up weapons, not the way the anti-Nephite Lehis wouldn't pick up weapons, but out of greed and selfishness, they say, good luck, and leave Moroni and the forces depleted. And he's angry. Moroni is angry at their greed. He's just like, he can't wrap his head around it. Here's my question. When is anger justified? I think anger is a natural state of this fallen condition at times. There's certainly ways we can mitigate it a little bit, but why do you think it's justified to be angry at times? And how does Moroni channel it in a productive way? He feels those emotions, but he doesn't seem to be dominated by those emotions. He channels them and does something with them. And how do you think that happens? What do you think he does? And honestly, to add an extension to that question, are there stories from the Savior's life that help you understand how to control this emotion rather than be controlled by it? I think there's some really cool examples, but you'll have to get into the New Testament to study them. Okay, the next question. This comes from 46, 6 through 9. This is where you see the Lamanites learning. Okay, so the Lamanites come into battle against the Nephites and they see all that amazing armor. And then by the time they come to the next battle, or a couple years down the road, they also have that kind of armor. They've learned, right? They're like, oh, that was helpful. We should make that kind of armor. When they get to the next battle, they expect that if their forces are bigger than the Nephites and they have the exact same armor, that they must win, right? But when they get to the battlefield, things look different. I just thought this was fascinating. This is 8 and 9. But behold, to their uttermost astonishment, they were prepared for them in a manner which had never before been known among the children of Lehi. Now they were prepared for the Lamanites to battle after the manner of the instructions of Moroni. I don't know what this looks like, you guys. I wish we had more verses here. We just know that the Lamanites are exceedingly astonished at whatever tactic Moroni is using. It might be a new piece of weaponry. Maybe he came up with some kind of awesome catapult. Like, who knows? Maybe it's a structure of his army that's never before been tried. Somehow he's been inspired to use a curious way to solve the problem and to defeat the Lamanites. And so the Lamanites can't withstand it, right? They can't get ahead of Moroni ever, because Moroni has the help of the Lord, even has the help of a prophet who he turns to periodically in these chapters. My question is this. I saw some interesting comparisons by thinking about what this battle strategy was and the ball of curious workmanship. I just think that's such an apt description. It's curious workmanship. They were exceedingly astonished. Nobody's ever seen this manner of warfare. And I wonder why God works in this way. We saw it all throughout the Old Testament, right? We saw trumpets take down walls in Jericho. We saw pots break and frighten off the enemies of Gideon. We saw incredible things like waves of a sea that is normally really still crash down and kill thousands of Pharaoh's army. Why does God work in curious ways, especially in moments of war? And does it teach you something impactful about how he can work in your life? I actually think there's something cool about applying this to the restoration, that there are some things that the world might try to chase and try to keep up with, but they never can keep up. The same way the Nephites always had the next thing. They always had the next understanding of how to be successful. And so they weren't looking backwards, they were looking forwards. What does the Lord want us to do next? That's what we're going to do. I think there's some cool applications to the restoration there, but I'm still sorting it out. So discuss that one, get into your scriptures and see what you find. Okay, third question. This is from Alma 47, 7 to 18. This is that Lahontai coming down the mountain episode. Here's what I think is really interesting about this. When I was reading that episode, I started to think about the contrast with Nehemiah. I have to credit, I think it was Elder Hales. It's in the notes. Elder Hales had a cool talk about, I want to say it's called Christian Courage, something like that. It's in the notes. But he talked about comparing this story with Nehemiah's story. And that set off all kinds of sparks in my mind. Nehemiah is the one we studied in the Old Testament who has to build the wall. Remember, they come back and they have to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and they've got all these enemies that are trying to take them down. And there's some really cool connection points. I don't think you get them quite in that talk because he's not breaking down the stories for you, but my hope is that you'll go into your scriptures and look for the connections. What does Nehemiah do that Lahontai does not do? Nehemiah is successful. Remember, he's the one that says, I'm doing the Lord's work, I cannot come down. I can't remember the phrase. Like, he's got such great one-liners. What does he do that Lahontai doesn't do? And what can we learn from Nehemiah's story, especially as you see it foiled against the story of Lahontai and Amalickiah? I think you're going to love the study. We're going to head into object lessons next, but let me give you one last little thought. One of my favorite parts of this week's study happens early on. This is when Moroni shines out to me because he's in that battle with Zerahemnah, and he has this moment where he invites them to set down their weapons and make a covenant of peace. And of course, Zerahemnah won't do it. He'll put his weapons down, but he won't make the covenant, which then propels them into war. And Moroni makes this really strong statement on the battlefield. He talks about the power of God, that it's not their armor that's doing this. It's not the size of their army. The reason they're victorious is because of their connection to God. And what I love about that moment is I don't think Zerahemnah ever had any hope of getting that message, right? Like, I don't think Moroni thought Zerahemnah would convert in that moment. So I'm like, why does he say it? Why does he cast out this bright light to somebody like Zerahemnah who is just going to pick up his weapon and try to fight Moroni anyway? Remember, Zerahemnah is the one that gets his weapon back and immediately tries to attack Moroni. It's dirty warfare. That's what happens. But I think Moroni knows all of that, and he testifies anyway. And I found myself wondering why. I think it's really interesting that when Zerahemnah responds to Moroni has just made this big declarative, it's not us, it's God. And what Zerahemnah says back is essentially, no, it's your weapons. It's your armor that's giving you this victory. This is in verse 9 of 44. Behold, we are not of your faith. We do not believe that it is God that has delivered us into your hands, but we believe that it is your cunning that has preserved you from our swords. Behold, it is your breastplates and your shields that have preserved you. In the past, I called this ultraviolet sight because I really think what is clear to Moroni is that no matter how much armor they have or how many men are on the battlefield, it's the power of God that delivers them. The power of God fuels them. But Zerahemnah can't see that. he doesn't have that ultraviolet sight. He can't see the hand of God the way that Moroni does. So in his mind, it's just the weapons. It's just your cunning. The reason this caught my eyes, I actually have felt this many times in my life. I have seen miracles in my life that I know for a certainty are miracles. And when I've tried to relay them to other people, they come back and say, I'm pretty sure it was just the doctors. I'm pretty sure it was just the medicine. It was great medicine. I'm pretty sure your husband's just lucky. That's wonderful. Good for you. Like, they can't see what I can see. I know the hand of God in my life, and I know that it's real. And so I testify of miracles, whether that person will believe me or not. Because frankly, I think that's our job. I think it's why we study stories like Moroni and Zerahemnah. Our job is to testify of the ultraviolet light we can see, the hope we can see, the beliefs that we have. Because even if Zerahemnah isn't going to change, down the road, this is early in the chapters this week, down the road, other Lamanites do. Other Lamanites leave the Lamanite forces and join the Nephites. Other Lamanites stop war because they've heard these witnesses. Even if Moroni couldn't get Zerahemnah to listen, I think others did. And that's how I feel about my witness of miracles, even if it lands cold on some people that I testify to. Someone out there has been blessed with eyes to see. And if I just keep sending this ultraviolet light out, it'll be received. It'll bounce into their heart and it will flare up at just the right moment. So that's what I leave you with. My witness of miracles and my witness of the Lord's invitation to step up and beam out in whatever way you can. He will bless others to have eyes to see.